The silence of my apartment is not an absence of sound. It is a dense, almost textile fabric that I've been weaving for a year, layer upon layer of acoustic foam, closed blinds, and unanswered calls. I am a sound engineer. I know how to build silence the way others build walls. And that is exactly what I did. I raised a silence around myself and called a sanctuary what was, in reality, a cell without visible bars. The apartment had transformed into an extension of my instruments. Studio monitors I never turned on for music anymore. Spectrum analyzers whose screens pulsed green in the dark like the eyes of some patient animal. Cables tangled on the floor like vines that grow when no one is looking. And the clock on the wall. An old pendulum clock I'd brought from my mother's apartment, whose ticking had become the only metronome of my life. I slept to that rhythm. I woke to that rhythm. Sometimes I wondered if my own heart hadn't learned to beat in the same time signature. It was on a Tuesday, when the hand marked exactly 3 in the morning, that the clock stopped. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It hadn't run out of wind. The pendulum simply reached the center, hesitated for an imperceptible instant, and stood still, as if time itself had decided on its own to take a break. I was awake. I was always awake at that hour, sitting in my studio chair, back to the window, staring at the hallway door for no particular reason. And then came the sound. A click. Mechanical, precise, unmistakable to the ears of someone who spent 20 years doing field recording. The sound of a key turning in a lock. My lock. From the outside. I was on my feet before I could think. Crutches in hand. My body trained in that movement the accident had forced upon me. I reached the door in seconds. 3 bolts, 2 chains, the reinforced latch I had bolted into the frame myself. Everything intact. Everything locked from the inside. The door hadn't been opened. On the floor, leaning against the jamb as if it had always been there, was a dark wooden box. No label, no address, no explanation for its existence in a place where the only entrance was locked from the inside with 14 fasteners I had installed myself. Inside the box was a Revox B77 reel-to-reel recorder. Old, but in perfect condition. The reel already mounted, the tape in position, the motor spinning silently since. Since when? Since before I opened the box, since before it entered the apartment, since when exactly? I didn't know. That tape spun as if it knew where it was going. I took the equipment to my workbench with the methodical calm of a professional. I connected it to the system, adjusted the levels, put on my headphones. I closed my eyes. I pushed the gain to the limit, and I heard my own voice whispering, with a surgical clarity that no external microphone could produce. A secret I had kept since I was 16. Something I had never told anyone, not my sister, not my doctor, not even myself out loud. Something I thought lived only in the most inaccessible corner of my memory. I ripped the headphones off, reeled back, knocked over a chair. I stood in the middle of the apartment for I don't know how long, watching that recorder spin, trying to construct an explanation that made sense. Couldn't. So I did the only thing I knew how to do in the face of the inexplicable. I went back to the desk, put the headphones back on, and went deeper. The first week was an immersion in technical paranoia. I used every instrument I had to dissect that tape: spectrum analyzers, phase filters, source separation software. I discovered infrasonic frequencies buried in the background noise, sounds below 20 Hz that human ear cannot hear but that the body feels like a diffuse pressure in the chest, like anxiety without an identifiable cause. Someone had inserted those frequencies there deliberately. It was a work of engineering, not a ghost. But then, while filtering the final layers of white noise masking the recording, a melody emerged from the depths like a memory rising to the surface when you aren't trying to remember. It was the sound of a music box. A melody I knew so well I felt the notes in my fingers before identifying them with my mind. The song from the golden music box my sister Louisa had received as a gift when she was 10, and which she carried everywhere until the day the car hit the overpass barrier, and the box, along with everything in that passenger seat, became fragments of things. I went to the drawer. I took out the photo. The two of us, me at 18 and her at 10, holding the golden box and smiling at whoever was behind the camera. I stared at the photo for a time I cannot measure. Then I looked at the tape. Then back at the photo. That box had been destroyed. I saw it in pieces. So how was that melody there? I spent the following days in a state I would describe as a controlled investigation if I didn't know, looking from the outside, that it was panic with a methodology. I set up a network of shotgun microphones throughout the apartment, creating a listening perimeter that covered every corner, every gap, every surface that could conduct vibration. Fishing lines crossed the hallways at ankle height, attached to small wind chimes I'd bought at a garden supply store. The entire apartment had become an instrument. And then I found the second tape. It was inside the refrigerator in a sealed thermal bag, as if someone wanted to preserve the recording from the ambient humidity. This time there was no voice. It was the sound of a telephone conversation between two strangers discussing, with the administrative coldness of people filling out forms, the medical history of the patient in 402. My history, details only my psychiatrist knew. The conversation mentioned sessions recorded without consent, observation protocols, an experiment whose purpose wasn't explicit, but of which I was clearly the subject. I was 402. I was the apartment. I went to the wall shared with my neighbor and pressed my stethoscope against it. Silence. I went to the other side. Silence too, but a different silence. The silence of an empty space, without the organic background noise that inhabited environments always have, that almost imperceptible sonic texture made of breathing and appliances and the friction of bodies against chairs. The apartments around mine were deserted. I opened my laptop and found in 2 minutes what I should have looked for months ago. A notice from the city about the scheduled demolition of the building. Residents relocated in March. 3 months ago. I had been left behind, or someone had kept me there, paying bills with money from God knows where, making decisions for me while I slept and woke to the rhythm of a stopped clock. The question that hung in the air of the empty apartment was simple and absolute. Who? The answer began to assemble itself the night my sensors went off. It was a rainy Tuesday, and the sound coming from the technical attic above my head wasn't the vague noise of plumbing or the structural creaking old buildings make when weather changes. It was a rhythmic, metallic dragging, with a specific pattern, 2 points of support and an asymmetrical stride. Exactly the cadence of my crutches. Someone or something was imitating me up there, reproducing my walk with a precision that would only be possible for someone who had observed me for a very long time. I went up with a flashlight strapped to my forearm. In the dust of the attic, there were fresh drag marks, but no presence. The sound had stopped as soon as I moved toward the ladder, as if it knew I was coming. So I turned on the recorder and transmitted a high-frequency signal through the system, trying to saturate any spy microphone that might be installed in the walls, and the response came immediately through the studio monitors. A distorted laugh that slowly transformed into a series of regular pulses, like sonar. Ping, ping, ping. Someone was locating me. I went down and straight to the sheet-covered mirror in the hallway. I had covered every mirror in the apartment weeks ago without bothering to ask why. I pulled back the sheet and examined the frame. I found the slit with a utility knife in less than a minute. Inside the frame, embedded with professional precision, was a titanium capsule contact microphone. The kind I used myself in field recordings, the kind that costs more than most of the equipment I owned. I followed the cable with my fingers meter by meter under the wallpaper to the false outlet in the hallway, and from the false outlet to the USB input of my own computer. Inside a system folder, password protected, were hundreds of hours of audio. The folder had been created 2 months after the accident. The password was the date of the accident. Typing that date was the hardest moment. Not because of the pain. I had already learned to live with the pain the way one learns to live with a permanent detour. It was hard because, as I typed, I felt I was opening something a part of me had deliberately closed. As if the password were not just a file protection but a warning. The folder opened. I spent hours listening. My voice, but not my waking voice, hesitant and cautious. The voice of a man who had learned to weigh every word before saying it. It was a deeper voice, more direct, with the confidence of someone who isn't monitoring himself. A voice that described with clinical and almost enthusiastic precision everything he had done. Moving objects 1 centimeter a night, recording the tapes with material gathered over years of work, creating the bank accounts in the intervals between doses of medication, installing the microphone inside the mirror frame. The voice that imitated the crutches in the attic. The voice that had placed the box on the threshold at 3 in the morning and then returned, down the same hallway, to bed without waking. I was the intruder. I was the conspirator. I was the only inhabitant of the empty building who kept feeding the mystery every night while I slept. The doctor's report was in the penultimate recording. The sleepwalking voice reading allowed the insert of the medication I'd been taking for a year without reading the back. Reported side effects include sleepwalking, complex automatic behaviors during sleep, and, in rare cases, dissociative episodes with personality alteration. I had built a case to investigate because it was the only thing I knew how to build, and because an investigation has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the end of an investigation is to return to the surface. But then came the last tape, recorded that very morning, according to the file's timestamp. The sleepwalking voice was there, with its steady cadence of someone who doesn't doubt himself. And there was a second voice, feminine, calm, real in a way the sleepwalking voice never was, saying, "Arthur, you're almost there. Just one more step and you'll understand why the dog didn't give up." I stood up from the chair in a single motion. I isolated that voice with every resource I had. I removed the ambient noise. I compared the spectral pattern with the file of Luisa's voice I'd kept on the system since the year she'd participated in a recording with me in the studio 12 years ago. The calculated similarity was 98.7%. I spent half an hour looking for the voice synthesis software I should have used, the original recording I should have manipulated, any technical trace of how Luisa's voice could have been reconstructed by someone who was sleeping. I found nothing. Not because it didn't exist. Maybe it did, maybe I had deleted it, maybe there was an explanation my rested and methodical mind would find with more time. But at that moment, there was no more time for methodology. There was the phrase, and there was the book. Why the Dog Didn't Give Up. I knew that reference. I'd grown up with that book on the shelf, and there was only one copy in the apartment. I went to the shelf and grabbed Cujo with its faded cover. Inside the first page, folded in 4, was a handwritten note in the tiny, slanted script I would recognize anywhere, in the dark, upside down, Luisa's handwriting. "Arthur, you're the kind of person who doesn't give up on anything you love. Not on me. Not on yourself. Please, remember that when I'm not here to tell you anymore. Elle." The date was 1 week before the accident. I stood in the middle of the apartment with that note in my hand for a time I cannot estimate. The clock on the wall was moving again. I don't know since when. The ticking that had been my only metronome sounded like something else now, like an invitation or a countdown or simply the sound of time that exists outside of acoustically treated walls. I went to the door. The 14 locks. I had installed them one by one, always at night, always with the justification that I was protecting myself from whoever was coming in. Now I knew I was protecting myself from myself, from the part of me that wanted to leave before the other part was ready. One hand locking while the other searched for the key. I began to open them. The first lock, the second, each with a different sound. A dry click, a creak, a smooth bolt, as if the whole apartment were participating in one last composition. The 5th, the 9th, the 12th. I stopped at the 13th with my hand over the final latch and stood there for a moment, not out of hesitation but out of something more like respect, for the year I'd spent inside, for the intricate engineering I'd built so I wouldn't have to cross that threshold, for the part of me that had worked so patiently so that the other part could finally make it. I am a sound engineer. My job is to find the music that exists in noise, the hidden structure, the pattern the average ear discards as interference. I spent a year convinced the world outside was just noise. Meaningless, dense, unbearable static, the kind of thing you flee from into apartments with foam on the walls. But noise is never just noise. There is always structure. There is always music if you know how to listen with the right instrument. I opened the last lock. The door swung on its hinges with a sound I had never paid attention to. A light whistle of air, almost musical, like an opening chord. The hallway light entered in slanted beams, and with it, the world. A child laughing 2 floors up, radio music through a cracked window, the distant engine of a truck, pigeons, the friction of shoe soles on the neighbor's wooden floor below, the wind pushing a door someone had forgotten open on some floor. Superimposed sounds, dense, without hierarchy, without a fixed beat. I closed my eyes. I listened, and I found, in the middle of it all, a structure, a rhythm, not the solitary ticking of the clock, something more complex, more alive, made of accidents and intentions and resonances that no engineer could plan. The crutches on the hallway floor made the sound they had made for a year, 2 points of support and a stride, but now the sound was different because the space was different and the man walking was different. I took a step out of the apartment, then another. Behind me, the door stayed open for the first time since the accident. A rectangle of dark and green light from the equipment that remained on, like a studio waiting. Maybe I'd go back to record. Maybe I didn't need a studio with 14 locks anymore. I walked down the hallway toward the elevator. And the hardest case I ever worked on, the case of a man who had built a labyrinth of sound so he wouldn't have to hear his own breathing, came to an end at the exact moment I stopped being my own ghost.